I want to bring in MS Now's Jackie Alemany, who covers the White House. Mark McKinnon was an advisor to President George W. Bush and John McCain, as well as creator of The Circus. David Drucker is senior writer at The Dispatch, author of the book In Trump's Shadow, and an MS Now contributor. So, Mark, when you see Vance making that kind of admission, frankly, at an event that's typically all in with this administration, and add to that the empty seats you see in the arena, does it tell us anything about how the war is impacting the ties between the president and his party?
Yeah, it says something's up, Chris. You know, I went to a Charlie Kirk rally in 2024 when, you know, a lot of media weren't paying attention to him because I'd been seeing some of his TikToks, and I went to a rally in Athens, Georgia, and it was just a sea of red hats, and the square was so packed I couldn't even get through it. So just to go from that to see this vision yesterday of Vance at this rally, and it confirms, in my mind, one key thing, which is that for a lot of voters, but especially younger voters, the notion of no more conflicts, which is what, and foreign entanglements, foreign wars, which is what Trump and Vance especially ran on, I think that that's a pretty clear signal from that turnout yesterday, the trouble's ahead unless they get out of this fast.
And David, I want to play part of what we heard from some of those attendees when they were asked about the war specifically.
I think Trump is a silly goose, and he does things that are silly. I personally don't think we should be fighting wars in the Middle East.
I just think it could have been handled a little bit better. I think a lot of things could have been handled better. But like I said, I'm willing to support him just because I feel like the opposite is just not the answer.
So the vice president tried to argue that Republicans can be against the war and still be with the White House more generally, which seems to be what that one woman was saying. But in a world where traditional politics, where that might have worked, has sort of been thrown out the door, do you think there are real warning signs, David?
Well, look, we know there are warning signs. There's been some real attrition from the president's 2024 coalition, which includes a range of voters, including these younger voters, many of whom voted for the first time because they just recently came of age. And for them in particular, even though Republicans broadly support the war, but for these younger voters in particular, they joined the president's coalition in part because he did run on this idea that he wasn't going to get the U.S. into foreign conflicts, particularly in the Middle East, and particularly not conflicts that drag on in this endless sense, or this feeling that it's an endless sense. And I think the longer we're involved in the war and that it can't really be declared over, the more difficult it's going to be for the president and Republicans in Congress, because you're going to see more and more restlessness from Republican voters. Look, as I travel the country, I talk to Republican voters all the time, and that includes just last week in Indiana, who take issue with some elements of the president's agenda, but still support him and will still show up to vote for Republicans this fall. The question is, how many of those Republicans are there? And right now, you know, the congressional Republicans are in a spot where they're going to see diminished turnout and diminished support, particularly because Trump's not on the ballot, but because you have a lot more discontent right now than you had a year ago.
Yeah, and if you stay home because you don't like the other side, as that woman said, the Democrats, presumably, who are running against the Republicans, that's like a vote for the Democrat if they lose that Republican vote, right? Jackie, the president seemed to almost acknowledge today that support is slipping, or at least that his messaging hasn't worked, although he hasn't made any apologies. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, Chris, Vice President J.D. Vance isn't the only one who is revealing his cards more, and this is quite unusual for a president who, at least over the past few weeks, has struck back vigorously against critics, people like Tucker Carlson, Megyn Kelly, and Marjorie Taylor Greene, who have castigated him for this decision to go to war. But this revealing comment comes on the heels of the war sending inflation soaring, gas prices to a record high in March, the largest percentage increase that we've seen in modern history, and consumer sentiment completely plummeting. Let's give him a listen, and we'll talk more about it on the other side.
We took this path. We knocked the hell out of Iran. They have nothing left. They're going to make a deal. We'll see what happens. We have to explain to the voters, so importantly, the great job that we've done.
So essentially what you're hearing from the president there is an admission that the stated reason for going to this war has not been clearly articulated by the president or the administration, something that has been noted since the start of the war, and him acknowledging that voters also are not understanding it, perhaps seeing the same polling that we're seeing. But I was talking with a pollster last week trying to understand why the MAGA base hasn't quite slipped the way other constituencies and sort of the non-MAGA Republicans have plummeted so far, who basically said that for voters, especially MAGA voters who listen to a lot of conservative media, people, again, like Tucker Carlson, Megyn Kelly and Marjorie Taylor Greene, that when they take their opinion cues from them, the approval rates don't immediately plummet, and that it would take some time for those numbers to ultimately drop down and trickle down. As you noted, Chris, at the top, those numbers, even amongst the MAGA faithful, are not as high as other approval ratings that you're seeing on other different issues, and you're starting to see mission creep as well when it comes to approval ratings on the economy and other key macro indicators. The other issue that this president is facing politically right now, again, is those non-MAGA Republicans, especially when you're looking ahead to 2026 midterms in November, where the House is fighting for a very, very slim majority, and you're having lots of purple districts where these small slices of the electorate are so important. We're going to see, I think, the White House, as we pivot towards November, try to clean up the messaging there to bring those non-MAGA voters back in.
Yeah, that becomes the question, right, Mark? How do you clean up the messaging, to steal that terminology, when Donald Trump, the leader of the party, has shown no sign of backing off from the message, we are winning and we are safer? Oh, and by the way, gas prices are going to come down.
Yeah, and Chris, even the economists who know a lot more than I do about this say that even if the conflict stopped tomorrow, the economic drag would last at least another 200 days. So that's the best case scenario, and it's unlikely to stop anytime soon. So it's a huge problem for Trump and for Republicans going into the midterms, which were already challenging. But the fundamental point that I think, threads through everything that we've all been saying here is the thing about midterm elections particularly is that it's really mostly about enthusiasm of the base. Is your base enthusiastic to vote? But it's hard to see under any circumstances where Republicans under the current scenario, or even a little bit rosier one, are going to be very excited about voting, because even if the conflict is in some way mitigated in the short term, it's still hard to see how we were in much better shape now than we were before the conflict.
David, the Reuters poll found that 20% of Republicans now say the war was not worth it, and another 24% aren't sure. Has the Iran war been worth it? Was the question. They aren't, at least 44% of them aren't sure. Is that level of distrust a problem long term? And when I say long term, I'm looking to November. Or could it go away? We have seen so often in this landscape how what seems like today's huge problem suddenly is in the rearview mirror and something else takes over.
Yeah, look, the Iran war in and of itself could end in the next few weeks, let's say, right? And then we're no longer talking about it in the same way. But I think that the broader vulnerabilities that the president and his party are facing are not going to go away. To Mark's point, economists call this the rockets and feathers theory, right? When you have geopolitical instability that forces gas prices up, they go up like a rocket, as the saying goes. But even if you can eliminate the instability and get things back to normal, they tend to drift down like a feather. And so it takes a long time for oil prices to get back down. And so it's going to take a long time. Even if this thing ended today as we speak, it would take into the fall, the heart of the midterm election season, for gas prices to come down, for jet fuel prices that affect airline tickets to come down, fertilizer prices that are impacted by higher oil prices, all of this. And this is simply exacerbating a problem the administration and Republicans already had. Voters, by and large, do not think that the high cost of living is under control. And the president, according to most voters, when you look at polling, is insufficiently focused on this problem. When he does talk about it, he says he's already defeated it and let's move on. And so you can deal with the war, which could have been messaged better, which could have been justified better. There's a great case to make for it, even if you disagree with it, that the president really didn't make in a sustained way. But you can deal with that, and you're still going to have this other problem there that hasn't gone away and has probably been made worse because of the conflict.
Mark, the Hill's political editor is arguing in something he wrote today that the MAGA break with Trump on Iran is imaginary, that the media is not going to find many people who are actually part of MAGA but critical of Trump. He writes, it would be a level of cognitive dissonance that would eventually have to be resolved by either leaving the tribe or swallowing their doubts. Cults of personality don't do reasonable dissent. Is he right about that? And acknowledging that in a purple district, just having MAGA is not going to win for you this November.
Well, I apparently he wasn't at the Turning Point USA event yesterday because he would have seen that this is a big issue for younger MAGA voters particularly. But again, even if you're a MAGA voter, a typical MAGA voter, an older MAGA voter, you probably have a pretty strong opinion about this. It may not mean you're going to go vote for Democrats, but it sure as hell may mean that you're not very excited about going out to vote in November and just stay home.